Hello, welcome to the social media reading of Haunting Mr. Darcy, written by myself, KaraLynne Mackrory. We are doing the re-release, and this is part of the giveaway for a free copy of the new and improved Haunting Mr. Darcy as we re-release it. So throughout the reading, if you comment below, you will be entered into receiving a free copy of Haunting Mr. Darcy. Without further ado, I will read this little excerpt of Haunting Mr. Darcy. I should tell you, I am not a narrator. This isn't something that comes naturally to me, so I'm a little bit nervous about it, but I hope that it will go well. This book was written and conceived in my mind because I was just thinking to myself, how can I make Darcy and Elizabeth have to spend a lot of time together, to have to work out all their issues without breaking all the rules of propriety of the time back in that time. And I also really love to laugh. And so I conceived of all these funny experiences and interesting situations that would make the two of them be put together that I just thought would be hilarious if I could make it work out. And so in Haunting Mr. Darcy, there is a carriage accident at the beginning, and Elizabeth, on New Year's Eve, her body is put into a coma, but her spirit is transported to Darcy's London library, his home in London. And Darcy, believing that he was imagining Elizabeth, that maybe his mind was going a little nutso, that he was hallucinating her, believes he sees her because she's a part of his imagination. But the scene I'm going to read to you is actually just her beginning to discover the library around her. She doesn't yet know where she is, but she's really enjoying some newfound experiences that she can have in this new state of being a spirit. She also does not know at this time why she's there and what's going on. She thinks she's dreaming. So without further ado, I hope you will enjoy this excerpt of Haunting Mr. Darcy. Okay. Returning her gaze to the books before her, Elizabeth began to read the titles on the shelves, her previous frustration and confusion over her prohibition from the far side of the room completely forgotten when compared to such delights. The shelves possessed a varied collection of poetry, seemingly arranged by genre. Walking slowly, she found she moved from poetry to history. The history section did not give way until she reached the fireplace. The taste of the owner, she assumed, tended towards that subject, for the collection before her was expansive and all-inclusive. This gave her pause, for presumably she was the owner of the library, as it was her dream. Surely she should be allowed to choose the contents housed within. Excuse me. Her hands were clasped behind her as she bent and read the gold-embossed titles, some from various historic wars, others detailing the lives of English monarchs, and still others being histories of numerous foreign countries. Pleased and intrigued, Elizabeth reached for a book, a history of Italy. Her fingers nearly touched the book when she paused, disappointment flooding through her as she remembered she could not lift the book from the shelf. To be in a library full of books and not read one that sent emotions flooding into her like nothing she had before experienced. Elizabeth further noticed that in her dream world, her emotions were intense and seemingly enhanced beyond her norm. She considered the book for a moment, and then her brow rose, and she whispered to herself as she stood, hand extended towards the book, "I wonder." She allowed her fingers to skim through the book's spine, and suddenly she was filled with the words of the book. It was as if they were poured out of a bucket over her as her thoughts filled with vistas described in vivid detail of Venetian waterways, conquests of land, and artists of such wonder that she trembled with pleasure in all its splendor. She pulled her hand back, and it was as if she had experienced the whole book without so much as turning one single page. "Marvelous, marvelous," Elizabeth spoke with excitement, the volume of her voice for the first time reaching a conversational level. Immediately she walked a pace and reached for another book that lay on a small table. It was a chronicle of Wellesley's actions on the continent. She placed her small hand atop it, allowing her fingers to sink into the leather. Just as before, Elizabeth was awash with his account of the Battle of Vimeiro, described in graphic detail as she experienced the British defeat of the French. She pulled her hand away, delighted. Although histories, particularly war histories, were not of interest to her, she found experiencing this amazing impossibility exhilarating, and the topic rendered exciting for her. Her laughter rang out into the silence of the room and echoed off the walls. No longer able to contain herself with any form of decorum, Elizabeth rushed from book to book, touching briefly each as she experienced wave upon wave of their secrets. All of the enchantments this dream afforded, this was beyond them all, and her happiness was immeasurable. Tears streaming down her cheeks as her emotions overwhelmed her, the feelings were both spectacular and indescribable. Such an otherworldly marvel suited her exactly in dispositions and talents. Her liveliness and satisfaction expressed themselves most becomingly upon her face as she explored the library, briefly touching volume after volume, hardly giving herself enough time to relish the blanket of words from one before moving on to the next. It was a beautiful impracticality and one she wanted to experience as much as possible before she awoke. Darcy's eyes snapped open in an instant. Disoriented, he was motionless as he stared in the blackness above him. Slowly, his surroundings settled on him again, and he remembered the ball, the visit from his cousin, and the headache that he now happily realized was gone. He was in his study and had obviously fallen asleep on the sofa against the wall. A sound woke him, and although he knew where he was and how he had arrived there, he still felt disoriented, for the sound he had heard was as impossible as it was beautiful. There it is again. Darcy's head jerked to the side. It seemed to come from the other side of the wall. That wall divided his study from the library, and the sound, although muted, had definitely seemed to come from the library. He slowly pulled his large hands up to his temples and rubbed them. Headache or no, he was imagining things now. The night was full upon him, and he could have slept only a few hours. The house was deathly silent except for the few times he heard the sound. Beyond his belief, he knew it to be the enchanting gaiety of Miss Elizabeth Bennet's laughter. His body tense, Darcy strained to listen in the darkness around him. For a while, there were no more sounds, and he began to relax back into the cushions of the sofa. Its shorter length was not comfortable for his tall frame, but nevertheless, his fatigue gave way. Darcy rubbed his face and expelled a heavy breath through his fingers. He was obviously weary and needed more sleep. Having come home from the ball frustrated, still beholden to his memory and infatuation with Miss Bennet, it was no wonder he had fallen asleep, thinking of her, and no strange thing still that he would imagine her laughter, like the remnants of a dream, drifting away as he woke. He turned... Just a minute. Hey, honey, I'll be there in a minute, okay? That's my son. He wants me to make some popcorn. I'll make you popcorn in just a minute, please. Okay? Darcy turned on his side, trying to make better purchase of the small space. He considered that he ought to go to his chambers, but he was too drowsy to make the effort. His muscles were just beginning to melt against the comfort of the sofa when he heard the sound again, louder this time and distinctly realistic. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up immediately. The disconcerted gentleman rubbed his hands through his hair and then against his ears as if to dislodge the frantic feelings coursing through him. Darcy stood then and walked directly to the door leading to the library. He knew it was foolish, ridiculous, and insane, but he also knew he had heard the sound that time. He looked down at his naked feet and detected no other light coming through the gap beneath the door. The library would be empty, the hot coals of the fire likely on their last hour of warmth. There was no way Miss Elizabeth Bennet could be on the other side, yet idiotically he yearned. He leaned his forehead against the door and breathed deeply. He needed to govern himself and this silly obsession. His overtired state, too, was surely to blame, yet he could not help feeling a profound disappointment in himself as he found himself reaching for the doorknob anyway. And then it happened. The sound. The most bewitching, delicious voice he knew, wafted through the door once again to reach his ears as he sighed in contentment. Insane or not, it was a tone distinctly created to pull at his heart, addle his mind, and in the immediate case propel him through the door. His eyes were drawn immediately to the glow before him. His Elizabeth, swathed in ethereal glory, stood facing him. His eyes devoured her beauty, breathing in her delicate features and settling it all with contentment inside him. She looked as if she ever did, except for the radiance of her person. Her hair was pulled up in a magnificent pile of curls, straining for escape, and its brilliance against her alabaster skin made his breath catch. She stood next to a bookshelf, her hand extended towards it. It was not until his eyes drifted up to behold her fine eyes as familiar as the heart beating in his chest, that he allowed himself to contemplate the truth of the matter before him. He was imagining her in perfect detail, and his infatuation with her had surely reached proportions beyond sanity. He watched as she immediately lowered her eyes, breaking their gaze, and with confusion written all over her face, dipped into a perfect curtsy. He smiled at it all. His muddled state did not forego the details, it would seem. Belatedly, he performed his own bow when he saw that she seemed to expect it. He almost laughed aloud at the absurdity. His heart beat faster, and although a fear was beginning to assert itself in his mind that he was headed to Bedlam, he could not but be pleased with his source of insanity. He laughed aloud, causing Elizabeth to startle from her frozen state and speak. "I am surely addicts to let, for her voice sounds just as I remembered."